Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, whether you're here in person, on Zoom, or watching the recording. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Evan Verplu. I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council here in Kansas City. We're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Lindsay Krasnoff to discuss a really important book, Basketball Empire, France, and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA. If you're not familiar, the IRC is a nonprofit organization here in Kansas City. We center crucial skills like empathy, media literacy, and active listening to bridge differences of opinion and promote informed civil discourse around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. And the IRC is part of a national network of councils known as the World Affairs Councils of America. And we have 93 chapters across the country, all of which hold the same mission of increasing our global acumen and encouraging civic responsibility. Again, we're really pleased to welcome Dr. Krasnoff here, and I'm going to go ahead and provide an introduction, and then she'll get underway with talking a little bit more about her book, and then we'll open things up for discussion. Dr. Lindsay Krasnoff is a globally recognized sports diplomacy expert, pioneering work within the basketball diplomacy framework, and a leading expert on French sport, notably how France became one of the major basketball pipelines for NBA, WNBA, and NCAA talent. And she's the author of Basketball Empire, France and the Making of a Global NBA and WNBA, and also the making of Le Bleu sport in France. She has a deep knowledge of the Fifth Republic's youth development programs and the French-American diplomatic and sports ties. Outside of her consulting practice, she is the founding director of France and Us, co-director of the SOS University of London Basketball Diplomacy in Africa project, and has written about global sports for The Athletic, CNN International, Vice Sports, ESPN, and the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and others. And she currently lectures on sports and diplomacy at the Preston Robert Tisch Institute for Global Sport at New York University. So thank you so much, Dr. Krasnoff, for being here. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much to the International Relations Council of Kansas City for all of your partners who have helped to make the magic happen over the past few days. And to everyone who is joining us online, I'm really thrilled to be with you here today. While the focus is initially going to be kind of the US-French axis within basketball, I hope that we think of it a little bit more expansively in terms of how these are just some of the in-depth examples we now have on the record of how different types of sports diplomacy works within kind of our new global era of sports, and that they can have multiple bilateral or multilateral effects that impact citizens, that impact communities and countries, as well as teams of all different types and sorts. So please think of questions and pop them into the chat so that we can tackle some of them in the conversation too and open it up a little bit further. So how many of you have seen the recent headlines around the restart of the NBA season and how the NBA and the league is learning how to speak French? Or maybe some of you have followed the career of Sparks, Nevada native Gabby Williams, who had a phenomenal impact in the WNBA's late season, but also really kind of burst onto the global media scene in her defining role with the French women's national team at the Olympics. And perhaps you were following basketball at the Olympics and watched some of those thrilling, historic Team USA versus Team France gold medal matches, both the women's match as well as the men's match. The first time ever that the same two countries fielded men's and women's teams to compete for the gold medal. So there's a certain sense that, yeah, basketball is starting to speak a little bit more French these days, at least within the North American context. And, the United States' oldest ally is starting to pop up everywhere in and around the hard court. While it might seem like there's a lot more visibility to this recently, it's been this way for a while, over 20 years. France has been sending men and women to the NBA and the WNBA since 1997, to the NCAA since 1984. And it's part of a kind of a longer term story. Yet when I interviewed then former the late NBA commissioner David Stern for this project in 2016, who was architect of the NBA's global expansion starting in 1984, he said that France was nowhere on his radar at that point in time in the early 1980s, despite the fact that in summer of 1984, the first European-born and trained player to sign an NBA contract was from France. Hervé Dubuisson, who played summer league with they were then the New Jersey Nets before they moved to Brooklyn. So, the story of basketball empire is really this question to help to explain how and why did France become the number one supplier of non-North American players to the NBA, both season over season as well as all time, and how did it come to be supplying the same ratio of players into the WNBA as well. It's a startling fact that most people don't associate with France. They don't necessarily, or until recently, perhaps, they didn't really associate France with basketball or France with sport because that's not the type of sports culture that has been exported to the United States. When we think of France and its cultural exports, we think of the language, the literature, we think of gastronomy, high fashion, haute couture, the high arts and sciences, maybe a little bit of music. You might think of groups like Daft Punk, for example. But until recently, perhaps it hasn't been very focused towards sport. But the startling fact is that France has been the landing point for basketball. It was the first place to get basketball outside of North America, December of 1893. So outside of Canada and the United States is the oldest basketball playing country in the world. The world's oldest original still standing basketball court is in Paris at the YMCA building there, which is currently undergoing an extensive renovation. But that story too is a really interesting one of transatlantic ties and through sports that I think helps us to better understand the role that sports can play more largely at helping people to forge closer ties with those in different parts of the world, how the universality of sport, passion behind it, can help us better understand others, even though they have totally different reference points and backgrounds and experiences from our own. And so at its heart, basketball empire is that story as well. It's about different types of sports diplomacy, not just how France became a basketball breeding ground, but it's also a little bit of a travelogue as well, because it focuses not just on mainland France and the United States, but also the French-Caribbean, which plays the outsized role in terms of helping France become a basketball breeding ground, and the complicated, complex legacies of France's colonial empire in Africa. So francophone African players also play, men and women play a longstanding role in this larger basketball story. It's a really underdog story too, because France actually, after the Second World War, both its men's and women's national teams did very well in international competition. The first time that the US played France in an Olympic gold medal match was in 1948. The men's national team won several different types of medals in the 1950s. And the French women were alongside the US women present and on the podium at the very first FIBA Women's World Cup in 1953. At the last FIBA Women's World Cup, the only two original participants who were in the most recent ones were, again, France and the United States. So both countries have these interesting, albeit different traditions of the game. But after 1960, the French national teams disappeared from international competitions for a variety of reasons. And so this is very much an underdog story of revival and resurrection and renaissance. And it's all because of different generations of sports diplomacy at a citizen to citizen level, which I think helps to underscore how individuals such as yourself, such as ourselves, can help to create a larger evolution and phenomenon. One of the fun parts about doing the research for Basketball Empire, even though it was done in a stop and start way over many different years, was that it's very heavily based on interviews, whether they were oral history interviews or with some of them media interviews that I did because I was I had pitched and was commissioned to write media articles on some of the current NBA players. So it was a mix of different types of interviews, but through those firsthand experiences, I was very much able to get at the lived experience of these players and what that was like behind the scenes, kind of peeking back the curtain of this. And most of these players being French or living in France, most of those interviews occurred over lunch. And so one of the more interesting lunches I had was with Boris Diaw. This is when the great French legend was still playing in the NBA. He had a 14-15-year NBA season, and I was able to speak with him over lunch during his last season when he was playing with the Salt Lake City, right? Utah Jazz. And a fascinating conversation that began with the same question that I asked everyone, including David Stern. And this question was related to a document I found in the French Ministry of Youth and Sport archives. It was undated, but it was clear it was written after the 1956 Olympics and well enough before the 1960 Olympics to indicate where France should invest ahead of the 1960 games to have the most success. And it's a fascinating document that first starts out by assessing France's current role in the world, militarily, economically, politically, and acknowledging that it is no longer a great power. In the new bipolar Cold War world, that France was a middle power, which for centuries kind of built its image and its name on being a great power. It was interesting to see that acknowledged in print by a government official. But it goes on to say, sports is a place where we can still have an impact internationally. And with the Rome Games coming up, here is where we assess we should invest our resources. We should invest them in the most high profile or most respected Olympic disciplines, track and field, swimming, and cycling, but also in basketball and fencing, because basketball and fencing are the two most cerebral sports, basketball for team sports, fencing for individual sports. And we French naturally produce the most cerebral athletes. Therefore, it makes sense that our athletes would excel at the most cerebral of sports, which sounds wildly kind of egotistic to a certain extent, right? But it was a fascinating assessment. And I use this question to start all of my interviews. So would you agree with the assessment that France produces cerebral players, or that French players are naturally well suited to basketball as a very cerebral sport? And I just phrased it as that, providing the context of this document, and people interpreted it in a wide variety of different ways. Boris Diaw laughed and he said pretty much almost verbatim, that's kind of a little pompous. But then he got into explaining how basketball requires high basketball IQ. It's a very thoughtful game. We need a lot of thought to understand the game and to think of the creative ways with which to play and to go about it. And most people I spoke with had maybe not the exact same interpretation, but talked about basketball and the way that it is a thinking sport, and that there's a lot more strategy and thought involved than other sports, which will not be named since we're on the record, but is one of the other biggest of global sports. So, it was always an interesting icebreaker, and I thought helped to get into this fact that a lot of things resonate with people in similar ways, even though we approach them very differently. So the interview process was very fun. The writing process. So what you find in the book is that the first third is a little bit more of a traditional history, both of the rise and fall of French basketball and subsequent re-rise of French basketball, its place within France culturally, which is vastly different from what we're used to in the United States. And particularly tracing the first Americans who went to France to play basketball and the impact that they had. And not just the cultural exchanges they had with the players they found in France, whether they were French or from other countries, because France has long had a very cosmopolitan basketball scene, but also, how they engaged in technical or knowledge exchange, so different types of sports diplomacy. It also starts to look at the first French players into the US, into the NCAA, as well as the Francophone African connection, and so forth. And one of the interesting passages I just wanted to read very briefly is from the first French player to play 4 years of Division I basketball on full scholarship, Patia Foucaud, who also played for the French national team and was the 3-year co-captain at the University of Washington. So also the first French player to really have that starting five position and co-captaincy. And she talks about, how she grew up in and around Paris in the 1980s, really kind of idolizing the NBA and kind of the freestyle of movement that she saw, and how she and her friends would kind of pretend like they were, in their own American dream. So when she crafted her own American dream and arrived on campus at the University of Washington, that experience was, as she said, magical. Her peers were intrigued to learn that she was a Parisienne and relayed how much they liked or admired her hometown. As she told me, "I'm always so proud to be French everywhere I go. I was a French ambassador, but I was also an ambassador for my culture because I'm French. I was born in Paris, but I'm Black." And so she explained to me how she had to explain to her US teammates that you could be from Paris, you could be from France, you could play basketball and do it well, you could be a woman and you could be Black, all at the same time. And she said it was very intriguing to a lot of people. A lot of times I had conversation about our history, talking about colonization and how that connected to French culture and to Martinique, where her parents were originally from. It's the Caribbean, but we're still French. To people from different parts of the world, this was just very different. It was a different perspective, but it broadens people's views of what French culture was like, and implicitly, who can be French, right? So that's just one short passage from the book that I think encapsulates a lot of different things, how basketball was a prism through which to learn about these different things and to break kind of the molds and to break stereotypes. One of the recurring themes for the French players who came to the US, especially in that generation of the 1980s and 1990s, so they talk about how they had to always prove themselves on the court, work 10 times harder because people thought that they couldn't play basketball if they weren't American. And I think we hear still a lot of that ringing out in some of the conversations we hear surrounding the NBA, in particular about European players being quote unquote soft, even though we know that is not the case, right? But this is kind of one of the long running stereotypes that players have had to fight against, not just French players, but any international players. So section 2 goes behind the scenes with some of the French players into what their US experience was like. Boris Diaw, what it was like in the NBA, the first French WNBA champion, Sandrine Ruda, players at the NCAA level, as well as players in the WNBA. So providing kind of a multitude of different experiences and how, Sandrine was playing in the W, but, her background is from the French Caribbean. And that's vastly different from, Deandra Trachong, who is also featured, and her family originally from Cameroon. So providing, I think all too often, North American audiences will hear about France's colonial past and their sports people and think that just because it's a player of color means that they have the same experience. That is vastly not true. Those coming from Martinique and Guadeloupe have a vastly different experience and set of references than those whose parents or grandparents came from Cameroon, Senegal, Black Africa, and so forth. So that comes through a little bit, hopefully. And then the third section, Going Global, looks at the influx of not just French players, but European players more broadly in the evolution of the NBA and the WNBA and the culture around them since 2010. So since we've had this remarkable continued increase of international players into the NBA, this season as well as last season, nearly 1 in 3 players was born and trained overseas. And this is no longer an aberration. We've had multiple back-to-back MVPs and other notable league awards and all-stars being from Europe or from Africa. So it's not just a one-off. It's increasingly rare that you have the American player who is MVP and season over season. So, how have the leagues started to change, not just in terms of an evolution of on-court play, integration of the Euro step, the revival of the three-point shot that was kind of incubated in Europe after the ABA had really pioneered it in the 1970s and kind of went elsewhere for a while. But also how the culture around the NBA has changed as well as a result. I think we were talking about this in the pre-talk talk about international players, not just Tony Parker, but Boris Diaw, Manu Ginobili, and others, help to foster the sense that NBA players, when they're not playing, they don't necessarily go to clubs. They go out for dinners and drink fine wine, and they do a broader variety of things than what had up until that point been visibly seen in the tabloids or in the press. So they're changing the culture around the NBA. Today, in and around locker rooms, you hear not just American rap and music or hip hop, you hear French rap, you hear Afro beats. So it's really helped to evolve the culture overall. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for conversation and Q&A and discussion, but I want to just kind of leave you with initially 5 parting shots from the book. First, that there's a paradox of French sports, that even as they win so many things internationally, particularly in soccer, but also basketball, that's not to say that sport is equally valued at home, right? So, and this gets more into kind of the domestic side of sport. 2, that France and the United States have a lot more in common with each other than most people think. And this became very clear in working through the basketball project. Yeah, there are differences, but particularly as 2 societies that are created significantly by long-term immigration, so very diverse populations. Also, both think they're both exceptional and have this kind of universal idealism about them. It was very interesting to study that through the basketball prism. 3, the power of individual citizens and citizen-to-citizen exchanges can be very powerful on and off the court, can ease tensions, can aid tensions, and that the richness that we're seeing in today's global basketball world, whether it's in the NBA, the WNBA, the NCAA, or also at Olympic or FIBA competition, is a result of basketball's DNA and global appeal. The fact that it was the first born global team sport, that one of the reasons why so many countries can buy into the NBA today or the WNBA is because it's an elite version of something they already know. That before the NBA exploded onto the world scene in the 1980s, most countries in the world played basketball, had their own basketball, their own hoops history, their own basketball cultures and idols. And so it's made the issue of empire and cultural imperialism a little less overt. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions or points for discussion. There's obviously a lot that I haven't touched on or have gone as much as into detail that I've hopefully planted a few seeds on, and would love to address that a little bit more also.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Krasnoff, for your remarks. This is such an interesting topic. One thing I've been wondering is about sort of the transnational exchange of basketball talent. Are there significant French clubs which have American players?
That's a great question. Today, many of the French clubs do have American players, and usually have quite a few of them. But they're one of the reasons why French basketball has long been so cosmopolitan is that it's been a place where everyone meets. So, whether it's American players, whether it's players from Eastern Europe, in particular, or the Iberian Peninsula, but also from Africa, and for a long time, still today, one of the major pipelines of players from Africa is into the French league, more so than other of the European leagues. So it's long been a kind of a melting pot of different countries and thus different hoop styles and cultures, which I think has helped it to develop it to be as open to outside influences as it is. And I think that takes a lot of people by surprise because I think there is a stereotype out there that French culture is very closed and very kind of insular looking. And I would argue that's not the case at all, that traditionally French culture has been open to outside influences. It sees something quote unquote foreign, it kind of takes it, reworks it, and then exports a quote unquote French version. You think about the croissant, right? The emblematic pastry of France that began life as an Austrian pastry. The French took it, infused it with butter, made it technically better. And it's something we know is very identifiably French. The way that France has developed its youth detection and training programs in basketball, but in soccer in particular, where it's developed this made in France brand and reputation, I would argue is very similar in pulling together, which took a long time. It took a few decades. It didn't happen overnight, but the French looked to other influences in how to find and train elite youth players and do it well. On the soccer side, initially they were pulling influences from a Romanian coach. They also looked at what other countries were doing on that. And on the basketball side, obviously looking to the U.S., but also within other countries and cultures. So this is kind of a larger byproduct of all. Questions or things you'd like for me to delve a little bit more into?
As a basketball fan, I have a ton of questions, but I do not want to monopolize the conversation. So,
By all means, go for it.
okay. Could you speak more to like the maturity gap between young American players and young foreign-born, or specifically French players? Is it more of just simply a larger cultural influence that's dictating the difference that we see once they get to the pros, or is it specifically within the youth coaching programs that we see in the States versus what's available in France?
So I think there's multiple parts of the answer to that, but it is part of the larger international influence. It's not just a French thing, it's part of the larger European influx. And a lot of that has to do with how their youth pipelines are structured. They have youth academies where, depending upon which one it is, either starting at age 13 or 15, if you are good enough and you make tryouts, grades are good enough, you are pretty much playing on their apprentice team. And if the head coach of the pro team decides that they want you to practice with the pros, with the senior team, that means you're suddenly practicing with guys or women, because they have a for both men's and women's basketball now, that you could be playing with 20-year-olds, you could be playing with 40-year-olds. It's the whole gamut. And if you are then selected to play with the professional side, not just practice with them, then you're playing professionally against people who might be twice your age. You are already living away from home because you're living at the youth center. If you start to play pro and sign with another team when you're 18, 19, you're living in your own apartment, you're figuring out how to feed yourself, how to do the laundry, how to get to practice, and doing all those things in a way that once you make it to the NBA, there's support systems to do that. But if you're playing pro in Europe, it's not nearly like that at all. So there is a certain maturity that comes with having to live and survive on your own away from home. at earlier ages to playing the game professionally with people who are older than you are, who have more game experience, who have more life experience, but who are also, usually physically differently developed than other teenagers. And so that's part of it. Also, part of it is that in Europe, they very much teach to the fundamentals of teamwork and focus on the technicalities. And and Doc Rivers has recently, or not recently anymore, last season really brought this up that in Europe, you're perhaps, having 5-6 practices a day, 5-6 practices a week, and then one game. Whereas in the US, it's quite the reverse, right? There's much more focus on the game, on the games and the individual performance and, kind of stardom than there is on the practices, the teamwork, and working on the finer points. So for a variety of these reasons, I think that talks to the difference you see between the European players who come into the NBA, the NCAA, and other leagues versus the homegrown US players that they, by nature of the system, have had to kind of formulate how to kind of function within this in a different way than if you just go through the NCAA system, whether you're 1 year and done or whether you do all 4 years, you're still only playing against other people within the college system. And usually there may be only 4 years difference to you, right? And, their bodies aren't developed in a way that, say, a 35-year-old body would be. So there's a lot of differences that come with that.
I'm curious, just talking about, the NBA's like early efforts to globalize more. In you talking, I'm reminded of scene in the Last Dance, the documentary that came out a few years ago, where I think it was maybe the 97 and 98 winning Bulls team went to France to play exhibition games. And I'm curious if in your interviews maybe that was cited as some younger players as an integral moment, or just speaking about if you could just touch on a little bit of those efforts. And I think it was really the 90s when the NBA started to globalize and what other initiatives they were doing at that time.
Yeah, for sure. So starting in 1984, the NBA began to make it easier for international broadcasters to replay their games. They would literally FedEx videotapes of games to different countries. And I think a key ingredient to all of this, not just the French side, but all of this is that the NBA has provided a lot of access to foreign journalists and outlets to come and to cover. And understanding that in order to be it, you need to see it. In order to consume it, you need to see it and have that access. So I think access and television have long played a role in this. Initially, it was through the broadcast coverage, but you're right, starting very late 80s, but really in the 1990s, that's when the International NBA Roadshow really started to come. The preseason games, the Christmas tournaments, not part of the regular season, right? But those kind of international exhibition games, effectively. The 1992 US Dream Team, that was orchestrated very much in partnership with David Stern and the NBA and FIBA. Right, it fed everyone's purposes to allow pros to play in Olympic basketball, and we are now a few generations into the legacy of that. So it's kind of good for the game overall. But that's once people started to be able to go and see in person these players that they had read about or seen on in TV, that has a different kind of perspective. So we do have examples of a young Tony Parker going to some of the the exhibit games that would play in Paris and thinking, I want to be like Mike. But then you had that turnaround where after the first 1 or 2 generation of international players in the 1990s and 2000s, kids now want to be like Tony, right? And so that starts to bring a really interesting dynamic into it. So it's no longer trying to be like necessarily an American player, but to be like an NBA player, like a WNBA player, regardless of where they're from. And I think that's what makes basketball really unique for the US professional leagues, is that as the professional leagues in the United States with the most largest international player basis, everyone kind of has a little bit of skin in the game. Initially there was a lot of, perhaps from some quarters, legitimate critique in France of the NBA, and fears that in the 1980s and 1990s that the NBA would rob France of all of its talent and deprive the system. That has turned out to not necessarily be the case, particularly when you have French players like a Victor Wembanyama, like a Tony Parker, making big contributions to the NBA. It's now a point of pride that league speaks French and has these influences, even though they're not technically, it's not really a French league. But there is, I think, a certain degree of pride that there had been those kinds of contributions, and it's not a purely US endeavor. So it's interesting how that's been kind of evolving over time.
So we have a couple questions from Zoom.
Great.
One, are there other European countries that are seeing an increase in the popularity of professional basketball? Two, are we seeing an increase in corporate investment or corporate sponsorship of basketball in France? And three, do you think there ever might be a French NBA team?
Great questions. I'll try to remember them and ask for the prompt. First, you're seeing an incredible increase in popularity of basketball, not just in Europe, but around the world. And I think that's what made the Paris 2024 basketball tournament so special, because those were the hottest tickets in town. It was super difficult to get basketball tickets, whether it's for the men, the women, the 3x3 tournaments. Those were sold out like not years, but well in advance. And it's because from Nick Batum, who gives one of the last quotes in the book, the rest of the world has gotten better as a result of all of this intermixing of this informal sports diplomacy that's incubated within the world's elite leagues, whether it's the NBA and the WNBA or EuroLeague, right, is also a contributing factor. So the rest of the world has gotten better, and that means that it's no longer necessarily a guarantee that the US team will win. That happened to be the case this year, but keep in mind that in those gold medal games, they almost didn't win up until Steph Curry started, tossing 3-point shots in the last 2 minutes of the men's game. It was a super close match. On the women's side, Gabby Williams's buzzer beater, had her foot been just a few centimeters further back, it would have sent the game into overtime. No one has challenged the US women's team ever in the Olympics period, let alone a gold medal match since 1996. I mean, they won solid gold ever since then. So, it was really a wake-up call. And I think the reason why the rest of the world was so excited for basketball at the Olympics this past summer was not just to see the super team, the Avengers, on the US team and its stars, but because also their stars were playing too as well, right? The Joker, Serbia nearly won their game against the United States. South Sudan, really, who have no globally recognized stars, but was really kind of the Cinderella story of the tournament, had a very strong showing and, pushed the US to actually have to fight for their win. So the rest of the world showed up to France for the Olympic basketball, knowing that they had a very good chance of getting a podium finish. And that's what makes it exciting. And so we've seen the global popularity of the sport overall rise, because it's not just US stars, it's Serbian stars, it's French stars, Italian stars, German stars. Germany is the reigning basketball champion, the World Cup champion right now. All the plot lines that come with that. So it makes it interesting. And even for the US players, that element of kind of elite competition and the competitiveness, they're competitors, right? You don't do it because it's easy. There is a part 2 and a part 3 of that question.
Yeah. So increase in corporate investment or sponsorship of basketball in France.
I think now you have, going into the Olympics and coming out of the Olympics, you've seen that, but basketball in France has long been what they call a closeted sport, meaning that most people know of it. Most people have engaged with it. Probably, it was part of PE class at school, but it was never until very recently consumed or mediatized. And also keep in mind that within professional basketball in France, there's not tons of money, right? So if you're a pro in France, you're not touching anywhere near the salaries that you make in the pro leagues in the United States. But there is increased interest from the corporate sector in basketball because they saw how popular it was at the Olympics, at the games. They saw that they were drawing everyone from kids and families to, you know, single adults to older adults and the whole gamut. And so, you know, that has a certain attractiveness, particularly if you're looking to increase your brand awareness and your sponsorship. So that's starting to change. And, you know, it will be interesting to see how that metals out within France. But to the last part of the question, will there ever be an NBA team in Paris? There will, I think the likelihood of that is much sooner than we are ever going to see an NFL team in London. Yeah. So, you know, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver has recently talked about, you know, expansion, not just with a focus on the US. And I would not be surprised if its first European team is going to be in Paris. Your questions, things that I didn't really address, but you know, I think one of the things that I didn't really touch on quite so much, but I think is an important part of this larger conversation is the issue of race and racism, which in France is different than it is in the United States. But it was certainly something I was asking everyone I interviewed about. What was your experience like with race and racism, given the vastly different histories and perspectives on it between the two countries? For the early African-Americans who went to France to play basketball and who stayed because it was an easier lifestyle for them over there, not just the food and the way of life, but also they didn't suffer the same stereotypes and negative stigmas that they did in the US, especially for those of them who grew up under Jim Crow. They said, you know, early in their careers, what was more important was their American passport, that and the fact that they played basketball. You know, those were seen as kind of status symbols. And it was not until more recently, in the past, say, 20 years, that they started to face microaggressions in terms of racism than the general population in France, perhaps not those old enough to remember who they were and, you know, how they contributed to a championship winning team. But, you know, within the broader public, that people would, you know, look away from them or move away from them on the metro, subway, or, you know, pick little nitpicky fights at the cafe over seemingly nothing. So I think and that speaks to, I think, a broader evolution, not necessarily a good one, but an evolution of the public discourse within France, as there's been a somewhat parallel one in the United States. For the French players, what's interesting is they come from all kinds of backgrounds, Caucasian, mixed, Black, brown, rainbow. And, you know, I asked them, you know, what was your experience like playing in the United States? Expecting to hear something, particularly as we're in an era where athletes are ever more comfortable with speaking their truths. And a lot of them said in the United States, they didn't really experience racism such that, you know, people saw them, you know, in their basketball status and how that mattered more than, you know, what the color of their skin was, that the reverence for especially professional athletes was very much there. And, you know, they're also pretty tall. So, you know, they stand out in certain ways from a regular population. For those who played within the Division I NCAA system, he said, well, you know, usually those college campuses, you're kind of in a very elite status, being, you know, one of the, you know, the stars on campus or part of the star teams, even though they themselves were not necessarily the star figures. And, you know, the kinds of accommodations that came with being a student athlete were perhaps insulated them from being on the receiving end, but also noted that many college campuses typically tended to be more progressive generally. So, and acknowledge that their experience would probably have been different if they were in a different occupation or in a different part of the country or a different part of the state. So that's an interesting difference, I think, that we very much need to take note of. They also point out that American thinking about race and racism is you're either black or you're white. And, not much room for much else. That's obviously changed in very recent years, but whereas in France, there's a wide variety of that and a lot of what they call métissage or mixed race people, and even within basketball. And one, Evan Fournier, whose mother is Algerian, but whose father was, Caucasian French. He said, and he talked to me at length about, how he was a little bit upset when the NBA first started tapping players of the African heritage and diaspora to help start playing in its NBA Africa games, and how, he was a little put out that they asked Boris Diaw and Nick Batum, whose fathers came from Senegal and Cameroon respectively, even though their mothers were white French. And they didn't come and ask him. He's like, well, my mother is from Algeria. Last time I checked, that was in Africa. And, his point that Americans didn't necessarily think of North Africa as Africa, simply because North Africans don't have the same skin tone as sub-Saharan Africans. So, for me, that was kind of an interesting window in on this discourse and, how that plays out.
That's a good segue. Another question, just sort of on the process of getting interviews with these pretty high profile folks, and maybe which of the athletes that you interviewed was sort of the hardest interview to get?
That's a good question. So in terms of the process of getting the interviews, I initially went through the French Basketball Federation, which has an archivist and a basketball museum, which are charged with archiving and preserving for the historical record, but also promoting French basketball heritage, culture, and everything that plays into it. And so they were very helpful at the beginning, especially, and continuing to this day. It's an ongoing partnership. They were helpful in, I'd write and say, hey, I'm working on this project. I'd love to speak with so-and-so who used to play for the national team. And they were very good at, forwarding the request. And if that person was willing to speak with me, then they would, provide me with the email and the phone numbers. So that was initially part of it. And then once I started to establish contacts within the basketball network and the basketball family, they would, one of my very key characters, who knows everyone simply because he's been in the game for so long, we'd be sitting there. He's like, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. We'd pick up the phone, text them or call them and say, I'm sitting here with this American who's working on our this project. I think you should talk to them, and so kind of through a lot of those personal connections that started to develop. On the NBA side, I had to go through a more formal process and had to go through the teams when the league was in session, which is most of the year. So I had to go through a very more official process where I reached out to first NBA International, and they advised me, who to contact within the team side. They would, pretty sure, also probably back channel it so that people knew that I've been in contact with them already on this. But I would send an email, a request, sometimes multiple requests, to the director of communications or basketball communications with the interview request. For some of the most high profile players, or at least initially for some of them, it was helpful that I also had pitched and been commissioned to write a media piece that would on a relevant topic or some part that eventually did very much feed into the book. So that's how I initially spoke with Nick Batum. I had pitched and was commissioned to write a profile on him and one of the earlier American players for the New Yorker. And so that was kind of a way of establishing that rapport and that first interview. With Boris Diaw, it was not a media interview, but it was a, hey, I'm a historian working on this project request. And when I sent it to him when he was with Utah, they and he were very open to it. And so they facilitated that. So it came about in a variety of ways. I have to say, though, as soon as I decided to expand the project and to include women's basketball, which was a decision I made in the early part of the pandemic when I came back to the program, to the project, that was the easiest part of doing the whole interviews because the women's basketball players, they're inter-networked in a way that I'm sure is probably there on the men's side as well, but they're much more cognizant, probably for many different reasons, of kind of helping to promote internally as well. And so they were fantastic, not just at helping to provide access to their former teammates, or you should talk to so and so, I'll talk to her, and helping to facilitate that, but also in terms of the kinds of interviews that they gave, they provided a lot more of the details and the background explanations than I often found on the men's side, or at least of the same age groups. Maybe, because these were the kinds of things they themselves had thought about or had never been asked about, but were part of what, how they think and interact with the game. The older retired men's players, particularly those whose playing careers ended in the 1980s, 1990s, they too were really great with a lot of the details and the small anecdotes and the things that I think helped to bring it to life. With some of the younger players across the board, I think it's a little bit more difficult because they haven't had the same kinds of lived experiences and or are trained by the media to respond in certain ways. But probably a lot of that is because they're still very much in the early stages of their playing career. Whereas, those who are in the later stages, like Boris was when I spoke with him, or recently retired or long retired, they have a very different set of concerns or thinking about things in different ways. Yeah, the interview process was fun. And that's actually how I got to a lot of the interesting side stories that became other research projects. Over one lunch interview in particular, they were all lunch interviews mostly. I was speaking with Michelle Rott, who is in the book throughout the book, because he's been integral in a lot of this youth formation, particularly, and the connections with Africa. And he was talking with a former teammate of his. They played on the national team together, and we're talking about something else. And there's a throwaway comment to, oh yeah, it was kind of like that too when we went to China in 1966. And they said it in French, right? So sowed, and I just kind of perked up. The historian in me remembers that China in 1966, mainland China, was closed, virtually closed to Westerners. And that 1966 was also the start of Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, when they purged or tried to purge China of bourgeois and Western influences. And then to hear that the French national team went to China for 2 weeks of basketball at that same point in time, I'm like, wait, stop, you've got to tell me more. And so this is how I got that story of, everyone talks about US-China ping pong diplomacy as this great opener to the West. No, years before that, it was basketball, and it was France and China, because France was one of the first big Western countries to reestablish relationship with mainland China in 1964. So basketball and sports were kind of that early initial stage of normalizing relations between the two. So the interview process was integral, but I also got a lot of granular texture and other stories and research that wound up being helpful in numerous ways.
I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the culture of amateur basketball in France, maybe contrasting it to US culture, where certainly it's got to be one of the most popular amateur sports that we play here in the United States, whether pickup games, rec leagues, or just shooting hoops in the driveway, and how that culture is either similar or different in France.
So it's both similar and different. In France, as with pretty much every sport, if you want to play on a team, you have to go through a formal club. And that requires getting a license through the federation that you're kind of in good standing, you pay a yearly fee. If your family cannot afford that yearly fee, there's usually a subsidy to help cover it. I think for basketball right now, each year it's about 250 euros. So a little pricey. Soccer in comparison is 100 euros a year, but you register and you're a part of the formal system. So that's how they have an idea of how many people formally through a club play basketball. They just released those numbers. Since the Olympics, it's gotten a significant, uptick in people who have registered to play with basketball clubs. It's the second most popular sport right now in France to be played. So if you want to engage in like club competition, that's kind of through the formal side. There are, the pro club structures and everything that supports it. There's then, kind of semi-pro, amateur, I think so there is increasingly a little bit of that pickup culture, particularly in what they call playground basketball. So the basketball courts that are on playgrounds or in public spaces that you do not need to be a part of a club to play in. And those are kind of very informal. And since the 1980s have also contributed to this larger basketball subculture within France. And playground basketball has long taken its cues very much from the NBA, from the United States, but also from Africa. So when you look today at what is the largest street basketball or playground basketball competition in the world, it's in Paris at a competition each summer called K54, sponsored by Nike. And Nike brings some of their biggest stars to participate in it or to judge some of the competitions around it. Jason Tatum has been a part of that. Gabby Williams has been part of that. Zion Williamson has been part of that over the years. So, it's not small names, big names. And K54 has a very strong, pronounced Francophone African accent to it. Teams from Africa routinely come in and compete. It's a celebration of African culture as well. So there's a lot of that intermixing on the amateur side too. So while until recently it was not necessarily super common that private houses would have a basketball hoop out in the driveway, as you are so used to around different parts of the United States. Some of the players I spoke with who are today in their 40s and 50s would say, yeah, I had to convince my parents to literally construct a backboard and a hoop for the house so that I could practice. And that was a rarity at that time. It started to change today, and it will be really interesting to see how the post-Paris 2024 impact may or may not change that. But it's always been a struggle to find spaces to play in France because the clubs control so much. But there is a vibrant playground basketball culture, and there has been a huge investment in kind of renovating a lot of those playground basketball terrains, particularly in and around Paris as part of the Olympic legacy. And you see some of the just high art concepts in and around them. So it speaks to the larger identity and lifestyle that goes in and around basketball, not just necessarily French or American, but global basketball, art, graffiti, music, sneaker culture, fashion, all of it kind of placing together.
What role does professional basketball in France play in culture? Kind of piggybacking on that, it seems like the NBA here in the States in the last really 20 years has reached a place of like a high culture.
Mm-hmm.
Like the number of stars and celebrities at a Laker game or a Knicks game is way higher than NFL, MLB, etc. And like you were just saying, hip hop, fashion, the NBA exists in this kind of like upper tier of culture here in the States. Is it the same at all over in France?
No, it's vastly different.
Okay.
The professional basketball is not part of the higher culture in France at all. Start to change a teeny tiny bit.
Even the NBA.
So
Like over there, if you're watching the NBA from Paris, it's not going to
The
be
top
very,
opinion makers and cultural arbiters, for them, it's still not as much of a thing. That is starting to change. So Vogue, the renowned fashion magazine, a brand, had a high concept fashion show this past summer, June, and featured several athletes, including Wembanyama, as their mannequins, modeling fashion. So, integration of that, the vast sponsorship and investment of LVMH and its different fashion houses and in the Paris Games, in the athletes, I think it's either Christian Louboutin or Manolo Blahnik recently launched a new campaign featuring their renowned high heels on synchronized swimmers, right? So the relationship between France, its culture, and sport is starting to change, but it's still a very long way from where the culture and sports, and particularly the NBA, are in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krasnoff. I really appreciate your time and your wonderful answer to our questions. And thanks for everyone who joined us either here in person or on Zoom, or if you're watching the recording. I appreciate your time and engaging with IRC programming. I hope you'll join us for future engagement. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Krasnoff, for your time and effort to visit us here in Kansas City and share your expertise. So,
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
all right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.